So Brinkibon and Stahl, we spoke about that a little bit earlier today. So this is the case where a company in London sent a telex to somebody in Vienna. The contract wasn't performed, and the British company wanted to sue the Austrian company for breach of contract. Unsurprisingly, they wanted to sue in Britain. So one of the first things that Stahl, the Austrian company, said was, well, if we have an agreement at all, it's an agreement that was made in Austria, and the rules of Austrian contract law will apply. So effectively, at first instance in Britain, the court had to decide, is this a British contract or an Austrian contract? I always find these kind of amusing because theoretically at least, you could put the same question in front of an Austrian court and they could get the opposite result, and you might end up with the Austrian court saying it needs to be decided under British law and the British court saying it needs to be decided under Austrian law, or more likely actually the other way around. The Brits say British and the Austrians say Austrian, and then you're having a completely separate fight. International law, you'll get to work on these little mind puzzles. So basically we're working out what jurisdiction we're dealing with. I don't think there's anything I need to say here. So Lord Wilberforce said, the general rule is that a contract is formed when acceptance is communicated to the offeror. Therefore, it appears logical that a contract should also be formed where acceptance is communicated. But there's no universal rule that can cover all such cases. They need to be resolved by reference to intentions of the parties and by sound business practices. So what's the takeaway from this for those of us who want to be lovers as opposed to fighters, who will be writing contracts? When there's any possibility of more than one jurisdiction being involved, one of the things you need to agree up front is which jurisdiction are you going to sort out your problems in. One of the things that I think is really interesting about modern Australian contract law is it's got so expensive to litigate these issues, and arbitration and alternative dispute resolution methods have become so much more reliable now, but they also give the parties another thing that we often don't talk about, but that is privacy. So Stahag, Stahl and Brinkibon here had to air their dirty washing, right? They've got to talk about their deal and have it poured over by the courts. If they had agreed up front to arbitration in Singapore, they could have sorted all of that out behind closed doors. And one of the things that's happening, one of the reasons why we don't see a lot of evolution in contract law is the really big deals, particularly in the technology space, which is where I work, disputes are being dealt with behind closed doors. So when I write technology contracts, I know from industry practice what to expect to see in a lot of agreements, but I have very little intel about how they are actually, disputes about those clauses are resolved in real time. So it's kind of interesting, just coming back to that idea that learning how to be a contract lawyer by reading the cases is like learning how to have a happy marriage by only talking to divorced people. That is truer than it's ever been now. Fax, really quite straightforward. A fax that's sent through a telephone line from one machine to another should be treated as an instantaneous communication, so acceptance happens when and where the fax is received. Email we have spoken about. So this is kind of interesting here, this language enters that information system. So there's really only this one decision that I'm aware of, which is a single judge in the Victorian Court of Appeal, Supreme Court, Lowe and Russell, which really just goes through the provision of the Act. It doesn't give you any significant detail. It's just this is when and where an email is received. So to finish up very quickly, according to my timer, 11 minutes. The the last question that we need to battle with is what happens when we can't clearly see offer plus acceptance. So, given that the general rule is the acceptance must correspond precisely with the offer, so it can't vary it, otherwise it's a counter offer, then that creates significant problems when we can't identify that moment in time. So your casebook has the extract for Butler, Tools and Excello. I think that Excello is probably a bit of autocorrect on my slide. That case is often referred to as the Battle of the Forms case. And I think I was talking about it earlier on. Effectively what was happening is there was a passage of time over which these two companies traded with each other. And when one wanted to buy something from the other, they would just submit a purchase order, which contained all of the terms and conditions that they were prepared to trade on, because they're a nice big company that has the ability to tell other people what their terms are. And then every time the contracts were, or the goods and services were delivered, there would be a delivery order which set out the terms and conditions, or an invoice that had the terms and conditions on them. And they didn't precisely match. So the question became, is there an offer and is there an acceptance? Is this one contract or is it a series of mini contracts that all might be different from each other? And so Lord Denning, you'll come across him many times, I'm sure. He's going a bit out of vogue now, but he sort of is responsible for a lot of changes over the 70s and 80s in particular, or yeah, 70s in particular. He's the one who coined the phrase Battle of the Forms, and he said the better way to look at all the documents passing between the parties, the better way is to look at all of the documents and glean from them, or from the conduct of the parties, whether they have reached agreement on all material points, even though there might be differences between the forms and the conditions on the back of them. Let's look at the conduct of the parties. So it's for this reason that courts will look at how the parties have behaved even after a purported contract has been made. So the test that they used is firstly ask, is there an agreement? When and where is the offer and acceptance? And then how do you respond to the contradictions? Because if you can find an offer and an acceptance, you're home, right? Then you can go on and look at the other elements if you need to. If you can't, then you have to delve into this meeting of the minds and whether there's some other objective test. So this is Justice Hayden. So the Australian sort of version of this it's not quite as liberal as the Battle of the Forms case, but in Brambles and Holdings and Bathurst City Council, we were really faced with a very, very similar sort of problem. And Justice Hayden said, when no offer and acceptance can be identified, it's relevant to ask whether an agreement can be inferred, whether mutual assent has been manifested, and whether a reasonable person in the position of each of the parties would think there was a concluded bargain. So if we can't find offer, match it with an acceptance and get to agreement, then we're going to objectively look at the facts. So the test that he laid out in that quote is effectively this: can we infer an agreement? By the way, it is good to make sure you get your verbs infer and implied around the right way. Infer is something that we do when we're faced with information. Implied is something that we do when we're giving information. I imply by my sly smile that I might actually run over time. You infer from my having a timer here that's going to go off that that won't happen. Okay? Again, I'm making up examples on the spot, but the language is really important. So can you infer an agreement from what's happened? Once you're looking at that, is there some kind of manifestation of mutual assent? Would a reasonable person, not the parties, we're not interested in their subjective point of view, would they conclude that the bargain had been reached? And if we have those things, even if we can't point to offer that hadn't been withdrawn, plus acceptance that was communicated without varying the offer, even if we can't find those things, we will have agreement. So framework effectively is start first with the general rule. Try and identify your offer and your agreement. But if you can't get there, then you still need to apply the Brambles test, because we still might have agreement. And that's particularly the case if the parties have been conducting themselves over a period of time, that it's not a one-off. So, I want to start wrapping up now. The slides include some takeaways in relation to acceptance. In particular, I've tried to just put on a couple of slides what the important elements are, and as is my way, there are a lot of them. And then in relation to agreement overall, because even though we've done this as two topics, topic 2 was mostly about offer and topic 3 is mostly about acceptance or consensus, the two of them together make up this idea of agreement. And you will already see we've talked about capacity, which isn't even a formation element. We've talked about documenting an agreement in writing. And I've hinted at the formalities requirement. I said to you in relation to the options that relate to land, it would need to be in writing. And we've talked about an offer needing to contain all of the DNA of the deal, that it needs to be sufficiently certain, that it needs to cover the material terms. And we've talked a little bit about consideration, and we'll talk a lot more about consideration next week. I'm going to finish up here. It is highly likely, I think, and I am voting for, that we will all be online next week. I will, unless this has been a disaster for everybody, but there are still 15 of you on board, so I'm assuming it hasn't been. Even if I have to come in here next week, I am very happy to continue doing it this way, and I would be very happy to meet my contractual obligations and be here alone. And you can do this from the comfort of your own couch, bedroom, bathroom, office, wherever it is you are. We will have our first shoot on Sunday night at 7:30. It will hit the calendar in the syllabus very shortly, probably tomorrow or the day after. You will get recordings of this and your very first assignment task sometime tomorrow. And if you have questions, concerns, frustrations, compliments, or you just want to give somebody chocolate, I'm here. And don't forget, my offer for chocolate for typos continues, or suggestions, particularly around the materials in Canvas. So have a great week, people. 3 down, 9 to go. See you. I'm just going to look and see if there's any questions. I'm going to stop the recording, but I'm just going to see if there's any questions in the meeting. If anybody else has questions, come down and talk to me. Just having a look at the questions here, guys. Great. Okay, I think there's a question from Christina that I hadn't answered already. Feel free to go, guys. I will keep recording just in case. So Christina asked, would I say that any method of acceptance is acceptable unless the offeror specified when the offer was made that they had to respond by a particular form of communication? And the answer to that is any method of communication that it is reasonable, assessed objectively, that the parties would have used will work. But you're absolutely right in your question in saying that if the parties pick a method, so if the offeror says, I will only accept this if you send me a WhatsApp, then it is perfectly reasonable for them to reject acceptances, if that's even a term, that are delivered in another way. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for experimenting with me today. Any feedback that you have on how to do it better, I'd appreciate. It is really hard to manage from a distance when you've got a room full of people as well. But I'm going to end the meeting now and we'll talk again soon. Cheers.